mind is broken into, say, two parts. There's this huge mind in the background that just knows how to do stuff and just does stuff. And then there's this smaller conscious part of your mind, which is the kind that might talk to me. And it's not aware of as much, but it's much better at talking and listening. And this conscious part of your mind likes to think of itself as the king or president of your mind, and that there's all these minions out there it can't be bothered to pay attention to all the time. But if it chose to, it could direct any one of them to do anything it wanted. However, this conscious mind is not the king or president of your mind. It's not in charge. Its job is press secretary. Its job is to watch what happens, and then when anybody else asks for an explanation, come up with a good explanation. So as you may know, the president's press secretary doesn't actually know what the president does or why, but if challenged, they make up reasons. Same for the PR department of a firm. They are public facing and they are doing most of the talking, and they are trying to put as good a spin on it as they can. So trying to find plausible stories that would make the motives of the thing they're explaining seem as pro-social and positive and as it can. And that's what you are. You, the conscious mind, are that press secretary. That's the reason why you aren't aware of what you're doing. You're not designed to be aware of what you're doing. You are designed to make excuses for it.
That was Dr. Robin Hanson, author of The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And this is the Brendan Carr Podcast. Today my guest is Robin Hanson. Robin is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute of Oxford University. His book is The Elephant in the Brain, and we talk about human motivation and why we don't know why we do what we do. It's a great discussion about self-awareness. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Why do we have such big brains? How did this happen?
Well, they're not as big as the biggest brains out there. Apparently, elephants have even larger brains, but they're still pretty big. Most people tend to think that we have big brains in order to do complicated things like hunting or digging or building a fire or making a hut. And in fact, it seems like we don't really need brains nearly as big as we have for those sorts of things. Brains were more of a weapon in the competition between humans. That is, if someone else in your group can outthink you, then they can take advantage of you, and you don't want that. And so you need a brain as big as theirs so you don't get outthought.
So it's a competitive thing is what's
Right.
driving this up.
Right, which is, makes some sense, but it's actually somewhat puzzling if you think about, what the brain is for exactly, in the sense that, so if you think about chimpanzees or other sorts of primates, they have big brains, and their big brains are there to help them manage this really complicated politics they have. So chimpanzee groups, they'll form coalitions, and each coalition will try to take advantage of the others, and it's less about being the strongest person, but more about playing politics well. And each person in a group has to try to convince the other ones that they're good, loyal to the group, and that they are very able and you really want them. And there's just a lot of what you would call Machiavellian politics, backstabbing, lying, deceit, betrayal in this sort of complicated politics that chimpanzees do. Humans developed some techniques to cut through some of that. That is, we have language and we have weapons, and through those we can make norms. And so humans went out of our way to try to cut out a lot of this destructive politics that chimpanzees do. We so basically have some rules, like nobody beats anybody up. We all make decisions together. Nobody steals anything. We make decisions by consensus. Nobody threatens anybody. And those are human norms. And we have the key meta norms that if anybody breaks these rules and you see them doing it, you're supposed to say something. And then we're supposed to discuss it and figure out what to do to get them to stop and not do it again. And if these norms worked well, they should be cutting out a lot of this Machiavellian advantage, a lot of the advantage from being a clever, mischievous, betraying chimpanzee shouldn't be there for humans. Because we've got these rules of making sure we treat each other fairly and that we don't, hurt each other. And you'd think if we were enforcing those rules well, that we wouldn't need the big brains quite as much any longer. We'd need brains big enough, say, to manage these, the language and the weapons that allow us to express and enforce the norms. But that would be a lot less than the brains we have. So this is the more sophisticated puzzle about why do we have big brains? Why do we have even bigger brains than the other primates when we have this powerful mechanism that should take away a lot of the need for the brains?
Yeah, and those mechanisms, weapons you mentioned, and then gossip and reputation.
Language. Right. So the key thing is, say, if somebody hits somebody,
Hmm.
like says, give me your fruit or I'll hit you, and they don't give the fruit, and so they get hit. Well, that's breaking a norm. You're not supposed to threaten to hurt people and steal things from people. And so if you see that happening, you're supposed to say something about it to other people. And then since we have weapons, even if you're pretty strong, you're even stronger than all the rest of us, with weapons, we're stronger than you. We can threaten to use our weapons against you and even do so to get you in line and make sure you follow the rules. So chimpanzees and other primates can't really do that. They much more have one-on-one battles. So if there's the top chimpanzee and he's sleeping and you punch him while he's sleeping, that's just the first punch in a fight. And you're probably going to lose if you're not stronger. Whereas for humans, you can kill someone while they're sleeping. And even from a distance, we can throw things. And a group of 10 of us around one person, the 10 will win, which isn't true for chimpanzees. Weapons and language together allow us to have these norms where we say, we have some rules. If anybody breaks the rules, the rest of us are going to gang up on you and
Now,
punish you.
how is it that language, the gossip, the reputation, how does that enforce a norm?
Well, otherwise, we'd all have to see the violation. So if we're not all there to see, you punch somebody, and I didn't see it, well, I have to go tell other people.
Mm.
And I have to convince them it happened. And then we have to have language to even express the norm.
Mm-hmm.
To say, it's not okay to hit people, but it's okay to hit back in self-defense.
If I'm at work and someone's stealing my work or something like that, and I mention this at the lunch table, and then a week later Bill says that the same thing happened to him, then there's this sort of collective that's enforcing this idea. That starts though with the gossip.
So that's detection. So we can not just all have to see it ourselves. We can each see a separate thing and then put those together.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's enforcement. We get to decide whether in fact the rule's been broken or whether we misunderstood something. We can let you defend yourself and maybe explain why what seems like a violation isn't really a violation. And then when we do something, we can coordinate together with language to do whatever we're going to do. So language helps in all these different steps.
Yeah. And in language too, you talk a lot about norms around conversation, and you have this really interesting metaphor for why we even bother to have conversations in the first place. You talk about it as though we all have kind of a backpack of tools. How does this backpack of tools idea play out, and why we have conversations in the first place?
So let's just start with the puzzle, or even start with the whole structure of our analysis. So we're talking about our book, The Elephant in the Brain. And the first third of the book goes over the general idea of why you might be wrong about why you do things. And then the last 2/3 of the book goes over 10 different areas. And in each area goes over the usual reason you say why you do something, and then suggests that a different reason is really what's more likely going on. So now we're talking about conversation, which is one of the 10 chapters. And in conversation, we have this observation that people talk a lot. And the things they talk about are often kind of trivial. They're not talking about the most important things to them, the most important information they have. People just talk. And so the question is, why are people doing all that talking? And if you ask people, why are you talking? They might just say, well, to have something to do, to be friendly. But if you push harder, they'll probably come up with the excuse of sharing information. They'll say, well, I know things you don't, and you know things I don't. And so if we talk, we can share this information and each learn more than we started out with. And that's a pretty good reason to talk. And of course it is. It is a good reason to talk, but it doesn't explain very well a lot of the details of our conversation. So the way the structure of our book goes is each of these areas, there's the usual reason we give, and then a bunch of puzzles that don't make so much sense from that usual reason's point of view. And then the alternative explanation we offer will make a lot more sense of those puzzles. So all of the real power here comes from these puzzles, the details that don't quite make as much sense. So in a conversation, for example, one of the details is if we were just sharing information, then you'd be eager to listen and not so eager to talk. Because listening is when you're getting the value from the other person, and talking is when you're giving them back something in trade for what they gave you. But of course, we're usually much more eager to talk than to listen. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the puzzles that we need to explain. The alternative explanation we offer to explain this and a number of other puzzles is that you're showing off a mental backpack of tools and resources. So the game is we're just going to talk about random things, and each of us is not supposed to try very hard to direct the where the conversation goes. That looks too awkward. We're supposed to just let the conversation randomly wander, but wherever it goes, your job is to have something interesting to say. If wherever a conversation goes, you always just have an interesting thing to say, well, you must be an interesting person with a lot of tools. That is, whatever the topic comes up, you reach into your backpack and you pull out a tool. We talk about skiing, and you mention how you know about this skiing versus that. We talk about, cats, and you mention how you have this way to help a cat versus that. And we mention tacos, and you know how to make a taco. Whatever the subject is that comes up, you've just got something interesting to offer. Well, that suggests this backpack you've got is huge and got lots of great stuff in it. And it's kind of a test you're passing to show that whatever we talk about, you have lots of useful resources. And so if I'm your ally and friend, that backpack of tools will always be my resource too, if I keep you around. And so you're trying to say, keep me around.
And this is something that I think it was really astute in your book, and maybe a lot of people don't pick up on. And a lot of what you talk about in the book is things that people don't pick up on when they see things from the individual perspective, but then you take a social perspective on the topic, and then it kind of comes together. Another place with that was medicine, too. You talked about how we have these individual ideas of why we need medicine, but then that the social piece was much larger. How did you come to that?
First, the basic context that our Organic book is about the reasons we say we have for doing things and the real reasons we have. And consistently, the real reasons we have are less flattering, which is why we don't quite like to admit them. Or in particular, they're more open to being accused of norm violations. And so we are trying to avoid being accused of norm violations. And so we are trying to attribute our behavior to motives that would make us more immune to that sort of accusation. And so a lot of the things we're really doing are social, especially in the sense of trying to show our abilities and loyalties to people around us. And there's this norm against bragging. And so a lot of these things we're doing are running foul of the norm against bragging. And so, in fact, we're in essence bragging a lot, but we're doing it indirectly and denying that we're bragging. So that's the general structure, and that applies in conversation, as we just discussed, and it also applies in medicine. So in medicine, the usual story is that you are getting healthier. That is, sometimes we get sick, and there are experts out there who can help with that. They can diagnose your problem and tell you what to do about it. They've got expensive treatments like surgery and drugs. And that's the usual story about medicine. It's this resource there to help you get better when you get sick. And that's, of course, a standard plausible story. And again, in each of these chapters, we go through a number of puzzles that don't make so much sense from this story's point of view. And for medicine, one of the most dramatic puzzles is that, in fact, there's very little, if not zero, correlation between health and medicine. That is, people and places that get more medicine aren't healthier. And even when we've done randomized experiments where some people were randomly assigned lower prices of medicine and then they chose to get more, those people were not healthier. So what's going on? The explanation we offer to explain that and many other puzzles is that medicine is more fundamentally about showing that you care.
Yeah.
So it's like if a kid scrapes their knee and cries to their parents, and the parent kisses the boo-boo and says, "Aw," and the kid stops crying. Why? The kiss is not actually medically effective in the sense of changing the scrape, but it reassures the kid that they're cared for. And the idea that we spend medicine on each other in order to reassure each other that we care. An analogy that we use is Valentine's chocolates. So on Valentine's Day, we have this tradition that you show somebody you love and care about how much you care about them by buying them chocolates. The chocolate industry likes that.
Yeah.
So then, now, when you think about Valentine's and buying chocolates, you don't actually ask yourself how hungry are they when you decide how many chocolates to buy, because it's more about showing that you cared enough to buy a lot, not that they're hungry. And if you think about what quality what brand and style of chocolates to buy, you actually don't care that much about what you privately know about the quality of the chocolate, not even what they privately know about the quality of the chocolate. It's about what the common perception of the quality is. So if they get a brand of chocolate that they privately think isn't high quality, but they have no reason to think that you didn't know that, they'll still give you credit for generosity.
Yeah, that was so interesting when you touched on that with the way that advertisement is done, because I think I often think of advertisement as aimed at me personally.
Right.
Like the advertisement is meant to break me down to the point where I believe some sort of message about the product. But what you're saying is that it's so much more about knowing what other people may think based on those advertisements.
Absolutely.
And then wanting to signal.
So that's in our chapter on consumption, which is a third of the 10 chapters. And again, when you buy things at the store and you buy services online and you go places and pay for things, if we ask you, why did you buy this versus that? Or why did you buy these things at all? You'll usually explain something about the direct experience this product produces for you. You'll talk about the cost or the quality, the taste, etc. But as we know, people, in fact, pay a lot of attention to what other people think about the products and services they buy. They care an enormous about. But it's not what they will say when you point to one thing and say, why did you buy that? So people are somewhat in denial about the fact that they buy things in order to influence what other people think about them. Now, if you're trying to say, give people the impression that you're a relaxed beach person, say, well, you have this problem that you usually aren't at the beach. So you could keep bringing up the subject of the beach a lot, which will get tedious. The question is, how can you project who you are to the people around you without getting tedious using the limited range of products and services you have around you? Well, advertising helps you with that. So if there's an advertisement for a beer, say, and the advertisement for the beer just shows a picture of a beach and people on the beach drinking the beer, well, that will put in people's mind this association between that beer and the beach. And now, if you're around people and you're not at the beach and you just hold that beer, now you get to project to people around you, I'm the beer beach guy. And so advertising expands the language of the images you can project to people around you. It means all the different things that advertising can associate with a product can now be associated with you, even if you aren't directly associated with them visually in the environments that you're in. And so then, of course, advertisers do start associate products with this incredibly wide range of images and ideas that we all find engaging, much more so than we actually see in the people around us.
What is it about so much of human behavior that drives us to be constantly signaling? That was something that came up again and again in the book. Was so much of what we do we think at first might be for ourselves, but in reality is to signal to others.
Right. So, I mean, the key thing is to realize you are the ancestor of 1 million plus years of humans. And for most of those 1 million years, your ancestors lived in these small groups of about 30 people, which met others of these groups a couple times a year. And in these small groups, you lived or died and succeeded or failed mainly on the basis of your interaction with these other people. I mean, there was nature out there. There were predators and prey and snakes and diseases and things like that. But that part of the environment wasn't as important as these other people around you. You really mainly needed to get these other people around you to be on your side, or at least not be against you. And that's what you were focused on. So you're the descendant of people who really were focused on how to get the people around them to like them and support them. And so that means, and a big part of getting people around you to help you and not hurt you is what they think of you. Your ancestors, and therefore also you, care an enormous amount what people around you think of you. Now, as you know, we almost all tend to say, I don't care what people think. And we go out of our way to say, I just do what I want. I'm not one of those people who's constantly trying to please other people. There's no, that's not a win to each other. And we doth protest too much. We do care a lot about what people around us think.
Definitely. And you talked about, getting people together and how so much of our ancestral roots were about rallying people together. And another topic that you touched on in the book was conspiracy. and even the meaning of the word and the language behind it. What is it about conspiracy that gets people excited and brings people together?
Well, a lot of our ancestral social world was about coalitions. Just like with other primates, we're not supposed to have coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
So the usual norm in a band is just it's all of us together. And in most workplaces, it's also true. We're all in the company together. We're all supposed to be helping each other. There actually do tend to be formed these sort of cliques and subgroups that are trying to help themselves. But that's illicit. You're not supposed to be doing that. And so people tend to deny that and hide it. But of course, it's real. Since we actually do have these coalitions, we are actually trying to, help the people in our coalition at the expense of people in other coalitions. And we're trying to do that as best we can, but we're trying to deny it because it breaks the rules. So that if we do it too obviously, somebody can accuse us of that and successfully convince people we've broken a rule, and then they feel like they need to enforce the rule. And so we're constantly trying to help our allies and undermine our rivals without making it very obvious. And so we are, in fact, constantly conspiring against each other. We are so much trying to deny it that we're often just quite unconscious of it. We aren't very aware of it, and we'll sincerely deny it and feel hurt that anybody would accuse us of such things. But we do it.
There are so many things that we might say we're not doing on purpose, but you find we really are, or that are a huge trend. How is it that we seem to miss so much of this or deceive ourselves?
You can think of your mind as broken into, say, two parts. There's this huge mind in the background that just knows how to do stuff and just does stuff. And then there's this smaller conscious part of your mind, which is the kind that might talk to me, part of your mind that might talk to me if I were to talk to you. And it's not aware of as much, but it's much better at talking and listening. And this conscious part of your mind likes to think of itself as the king or president of your mind. It likes to think of itself as the thing that's in charge, and that there's all these minions out there it can't be bothered to pay attention to all the time. But if it chose to, it could direct any one of them to do anything it wanted. However, in fact, this conscious mind, the one I'm talking to, is not the king or president of your mind. It's not in charge. Its job is press secretary. Its job is to watch what happens, and then when anybody else asks for an explanation, come up with a good explanation. So as you may know, the president's press secretary doesn't actually know what the president does or why, but if challenged, they make up reasons. Same for the PR department of a firm. They are public facing and they are doing most of the talking, and they are trying to put as good a spin on it as they can. So trying to find plausible stories that would make the motives of the thing they're explaining seem as pro-social and positive and least susceptible to norm accusations as it can. And that's what you are. You, the conscious mind, are that press secretary. So that's the reason why you aren't aware of what you're doing. You're not designed to be aware of what you're doing. You are designed to make excuses for it.
And it seems really counterintuitive that it would be helpful to not understand what's really happening, but it is. Why is it good for us to have some of this self-deception?
Well, if you were just, Robinson Crusoe all alone, well, there is no point to deceiving anyone then. You'd want to be as accurate and precise as you possibly could. But in a world where the main obstacles and things you have to deal with are other people, and that the main thing you're trying to do to them is make them think well of you, well, now you face a trade-off. Being realistic may well make them think less of you. And it may well be worth rose-colored glasses that present a better image of yourself to other people, which convinces them to think better of you, even if that comes at some cost of making some errors in other decisions.
Do you think it's worth a hard self-analysis to try and overcome this, or do you think it's better to just accept it?
So that is sort of the tough question of our conclusion of our book.
Mm-hmm.
If we're right, then you were designed not to know the things our book is telling you about. You were designed not to know them because it was roughly on average in your interest not to know. You were better off being ignorant. So from that point of view, we are doing you a disservice. We are telling you things you didn't want to know. Too much information is our book. That's probably true overall on average, to the extent that the world you live in is like the world your mind was designed for. However, not everybody today is really in that sort of situation. In particular, say, social scientists and policy analysts, They need to understand the world they're dealing with so that they can come up with effective policy changes. And therefore, they need to be more realistic if they're going to come up with effective policy changes. Now, if they're just going to say things that people want to hear, then they don't need to be realistic. They need to pander to whatever preconceptions everybody has. But if you want to be effective at figuring out real changes that would actually help, then you need to be more realistic. Similarly, you might be a salesperson or manager for whom it matters a lot more that you actually know what's going on. And then in that case, it might be worth this extra cost of you looking reality more square and admitting to things so that you can better judge what motivates your clients or subordinates in the work environment and other people around you. Finally, you might be someone who, somewhat like me, is just not that intuitively good at the social world. Somewhat nerdy, Asperger's, in the range of when you just intuitively do social things, you're not as good at it. It just doesn't work as well as for other people. Well, for someone like you, if you are, say, especially analytic or able to think things through, it might be worth your using those abilities to more consciously understand the world around you, because then you may be able to consciously strategize and be a little more effective at your social behavior because your inherited abilities are just not so good.
So what is it then in this self-deception that it seems to work well for athletes? You pointed to a study in the book about I think it was swimmers who had performed better in a trial for a large race or something like that, who also were having more self-delusion. That there seemed to be a correlation between athletic performance and self-delusion. How does that play out?
We have to motivate ourselves, and sometimes lying to ourselves seems to help. I'm not sure our general theory is particularly accounting for that, but it's not saying the opposite. We are just more in the habit of putting more effort into things, and when other people around us believe that we can, and we often can sort of convince other people to back off the more we convince them that we're stronger. So part of what athletes are doing is trying to psych out their opponents. There's some degree of psyching out themselves, but there's us also just trying to convince the other people that you are really going to try hard and you're not going to quit. And they're going to need to try extra hard, or maybe they should quit.
Yeah, that self-belief thing is huge in sports, especially where you really can intimidate an opponent. I look at boxers or mixed martial artists. If you know Conor McGregor, he's big in the UFC, and he is this swaggering, larger than life character. He does this sort of dance when he shows up at the ring, and you see this in rugby too. They'll have special like haka rituals where they're really out to psych out the other side. It's more about that than it is about any sort of warm up or anything like that in athletics. This seems to be a theme.
Sure. Well, so humans who, after the era of foragers, started to fight more wars with each other, a very common sort of tribal war scenario is all the warriors show up in an area and then they do a bunch of dances for a while where they each just like try and emphasize how coordinated and energetic and mad they are, determined they are. And they may do that for a long time, and then one side may become convinced and then go away. And animals do something similar often, where they're confronting each other, and then they'll growl and stamp their feet and do various things to try to convince the other one that I'm stronger and you should just give up. So it's not true that you can just win by being more confident. So sometimes people present it as if the secret to success is just to be more confident. I think that's wrong. I think confidence is a credible signal of ability, but it doesn't work unless you have the ability that goes with it. So in general, a lot of the things we're doing in our lives are showing off. And the reason they work is that, in fact, the thing that you're showing is connected to the thing that you're showing off. So we talked about showing that you care. Well, when you spend more on someone, then you are showing that you care more about them. Because if you didn't care so much about them, you wouldn't be willing to spend as much on them. And when you have lots of clever things you can say, you are showing you have a bigger mental backpack, etc. And confidence is a credible signal that you have more ability, because if you act really confident and you don't have more ability, you're really going to get hurt. And people challenge the swagger and you fight them and you lose badly. I mean, swagger works for someone to show that they have confidence when they actually have confidence, when they actually think they have a decent chance of winning.
Right, but yeah, it can also draw attention too. People tend to want to knock down that sort of person
Exactly.
too, and show that they're even bigger and stronger than them in the first place.
So when you're not as strong as the people around you, often the rational strategy is to be the wallflower,
Mm.
to hide, to back off, to not act like you're threatening other people or trying to dominate, because that's when they will accept that you have not bidding for superiority over them, and you have accepted that you are somewhat inferior, and then they'll let you be. And that's quite commonly the reasonable strategy. Defying everybody and demanding that they pay attention to you and declaring that you can beat anybody around you is only a good strategy when you think you can actually beat everybody around you. When it's pretty clear that you can't, it's really a recipe for getting squashed.
This whole game theory strategy thing too that comes up again and again in your book, that so many of these behaviors seem to link back to a pretty defined strategy. And you talk about a few too where you would even be better off to limit your options. Like you talk about playing chicken and how it would actually be advantageous to limit your options. Why is that?
Sometimes your options give other people options.
Mm.
So in the classic game of chicken, say two people driving cars toward each other, and if one of them doesn't swerve out of the way, then they're going to smash. And the usual idea is whoever swerves first is the loser because they were less confident and less tough and less determined. Obviously, both of them being determined can mean they smash, which is a pretty bad outcome. And part of the problem is that you can swerve. So, one classic solution is to take off of your steering wheel and wave it outside the car at the other driver, as basically saying, I can't turn. If one of us is going to turn, it's going to have to be you.
Mm.
And that's, limiting your options can often give you a strategic advantage with somebody else. Another example might be you go, well, it worked better in the past, but you would go to, say, a jeweler, and you would shop for some, say, ring that you were going to buy. And then when you get to the negotiation over price phase, you'd take out your wallet and say, well, here's my wallet. I've got $600 in it, and that's all I've got. And I'm offering $600 for that ring. And if they say $700, you'll say, I can't give you $700. This is all I brought with me. If you want me to pay $700, I'm going to have to leave and maybe come back again, and maybe I won't come back again. So you're trying to commit to only having the $600 in your wallet so that you can commit to not paying more than $600. Of course, then they could say, well, I want your shoes. Give me your watch. Things like that. So don't take any of those things either, or don't take fancy things. But again, it's, trying to limit your options can help give you a strategic advantage when, trying to make it clear that you don't have the option the other person wants you to have.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, but it works. It totally works. Robin, something you talked a little bit about before too is leaders and how it's important for leaders to signal that they care. And I think often people are caught up in the idea of a leader as this super alpha figure constantly pushing forward, and this caring piece is missed. Why is that piece of a leader so important? Why do we need to see that our leaders care?
Humans have two kinds of status. We discuss this a bit in the book, although we don't talk so much about the leadership connections. One kind of status is dominance, the ability to project power. And the other kind of status is prestige, admiration, and people wanting to copy you and be around you. Prestige is the approved kind of status, and dominance is the disapproved. So standard human norms are to say no one should try to be showing dominance, and anybody who does try to show dominance, other people should be trying to resist that. And so we have these strong human norms that we are not supposed to submit to dominance, and we're not supposed to allow people to project dominance. On the other hand, we are allowed to and even encouraged to have prestige. You are supposed to be the admired hunter, the admired weaver, the admired storyteller that is good at something and then offers your services to other people freely. And they not only benefit from your services, but then they'd like to be like you. And so they look at you and they watch you and they want to copy you. And it's okay to have that kind of status. And so this is the ancient human tradition around people and, of course, leaders. So it's okay to follow a leader who's prestigious and not okay to follow a leader who's dominant. So, of course, most of the negative stories we ever hear about bad bosses are about dominant bosses. They just throw their weight around. They're rude. They're not very impressive. They are say dumb or crude, selfish, and then they are not very considerate. They are just demanding, threatening other people with firing them or saying bad things about them or hitting them, and that's how they get them to do things. And that's, we're all primed to just hate that and do everything we can to resist it. And so, if you are a real boss, you are trying not to fit that mold. That's exactly the sort of mold that will get everybody to try to undermine you and reject you. What you're trying to do is to fit the prestige mold. You're trying to say, I'm here and I'm around to help. I'm available, and you basically like me so much and admire me so much, you'll do what I suggest just out of wanting to be around me. People are trying to be prestigious, and this is one of the reasons that prestigious people get paid a lot more to be managers. So there's this huge correlation whereby people who are taller and more handsome and have better degrees, more articulate, they are much more often bosses. And it's not clear they're actually more effective at making boss-like decisions, but they are more effective at getting people to accept them as being boss, accept them in that role. Most of us in our world have bosses. Now, most of our ancestors did not. It's important to realize. In the forager world, people did not have bosses. And even through most of the farming world, most people did not have bosses. They might have a king. There might be a lord of the manor. But still, most people did farming or cobbling or fishing or something where they were mostly in charge of what they were doing in their immediate environment and working with people around them who were their equals. So we in the modern world are unusual compared to most of our ancestors in actually most of us having bosses. So we were really pushing this thing about humans not liking bosses. And so, of course, and most of us tend to think when we think of somebody else with a boss as poor them, and isn't it terrible? And that's sort of one of the complaints about capitalism, which isn't quite fair because all other systems have bosses too. Hey, they've got these bosses and that's terrible. And each of us has this problem that we typically have a boss. And if we see our boss as dominant, we feel obligated to resist them and undermine them and not obey them because that's human nature. So what we each tend to do is find an excuse for believing that our boss is prestigious. We might think other bosses are bad, but we tend to think our boss is okay. Our boss is okay and decent enough and doing their job and, has earned the role. Similarly, like most people think politicians are corrupt, but not their politician.
Right.
And same with bosses. And the key stat in the ancient world, it was a standard truism that we have a king and our neighbors have tyrants. So we could go conquer our neighbors and replace their tyrant. And that was okay because they didn't really want their tyrant. Anybody who would want a tyrant. But we want our king, of course. If they're attacking us and our king, then we're going to resist that because we love our king. And what's the difference between a king and a tyrant? Prestige versus dominance.
Totally. And again, another case of self-deception too. My guy's a king, but yours is a tyrant. That's classic.
Yes, and it continues today, of course.
Yeah. And one place where you touch on that we can kind of be groomed to get used to having a boss is the school system. That there are a lot of societal motivations that we don't really want to talk about, but that are in the modern school system.
Right. So like I said, the modern workplace has a lot more bosses than ancient world ever did. And ordinary workers in the modern workplace are given orders about what to do in much more detail and much more frequently, and they're ranked relative to other people. So if you talk to people who tried to hire workers who were from a traditional culture, you'll find that one of the main problems they have is that people just really chafe at being told what to do. They chafe at being assigned to a job that has a lower status than somebody else who they think is really lower status than them. They're really sensitive about these things. And apparently modern workers in our modern world are not so sensitive about all those things. And it seems that school is one of the key things that helps us make this transition to our world. School gets us used to being ranked and dominated, literally.
Yes.
And of course, it's not what school says it's about. But it is, in fact, a substantial part of what school is really about, getting you used to modern workplace practices. So how do we manage to do that? Well, one way is we try to make school seem very prestigious. And so school's talks about prestigious subjects and teaches you prestigious subjects. And, you're eager to go to a prestigious school with a prestigious teacher. and you get to pick your prestigious classes. And we get you into the habit of doing these, basically being told what to do and assigning jobs and doing them, but under the excuse that what you're really doing here is hanging around a prestigious person and learning how to do things by copying them. Because this, of course, is what most of our ancestors did. There was the best hunter in the group, and other people wanted to learn to be like that hunter, and they would try to be near him and watch what he did and try to copy him so that they could do what that person did and be as good a hunter. That's what prestige was, and that was a standard part of human tradition. So again, it was terrible to be given orders and obey them, but it was fine to be eager to copy someone who was better than you at doing something.
Yeah, that sounds a whole lot better.
And so we set up school with that habit of you're just learning how to do something better. But through many years of school, we are in the habit of doing what the teacher tells us under the excuse that we are learning how to do something better. And after enough years of practice, we can switch to a workplace where we're basically told the same sort of things, but now it's a job.
Mm-hmm.
But our boss is pretty prestigious. They have a better degree than we do. They dress better. They're more articulate. They're more handsome. And we can still slot them into the prestigious slot. But now we accept of doing the same sort of things we did at school, which again, most people in the ancient world would not have accepted.
Robin, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on a little bit of your other work just briefly. I watched your TED Talk about The Age of M's, your previous book, and I found it fascinating that, this idea that in the future we're going to have whole brain emulation and things like that. And if you could see the bookshelf behind me, I've got a lot of books right up that alley. Homo Deus and Singularity is Near and that sort of thing. Superintelligence. Do you see a particular link between that work that you were doing in that book and the lessons that you learned in writing Elephant in the Brain?
Well, I think people are not usually honest with themselves about why they're interested in the future. So in fact, it's a truism, say, of science fiction, that science fiction is mostly about the world of the reader and the author and not about some future world. The future world is some sort of indirect metaphor that lets you talk about your world in a different way. And I think that's actually true to a large extent. When we talk politics and when we talk the future, we're often using that forum as a way to talk values. People love to talk values. And yeah. I think if you pick up those books on that shelf behind you, you'll find they're mostly talking values. And they're mostly talking basic fundamental values in the context of some future issues. But it's striking that, in most of your ordinary life around you, when you decide what route to take home or what food to pick up for dinner or whether to work late this weekend, most of your analysis of most of these topics doesn't rely that much on analyzing values. I mean, values matter to some degree, but they're usually the small part of the problem. But when we get to the future, all of a sudden people think values are everything, and they spend almost all their time talking about values. And that's because they don't actually care that much about the future. They care about talking values so they can project themselves around you. It's like the backpack story. Here you're trying to show off how much you value community or how much you value creativity or exploration, whatever it is. And so, which is fine if people want to use the future to talk about values and they want to talk about values, why not? But I'm actually interested in the future, yeah. The actual future, from their point of view, not from how it speaks to my values. And so I wanted to show that you could actually do that sort of exercise. Because many people basically say, well, we're only ever talking about values because we really can't talk about anything else. And that's an excuse, I think. They're wrong. You can actually work out specifics of what would actually happen in the future. A lot of detailed facts, not just values. And you could show that. And in addition, you should expect that most any realistic future scenario will be just really hard for you to project your values onto. Because if you look in the past, you realize people from 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, they would have found it pretty hard to understand our world, but even harder to understand how to project their values onto us. We're just weird. We don't align up with their heaven or hell scenarios. We're just off in some other direction. And that's what you should expect our future to be like. You should expect it to just upend your presumptions about values and to be hard to evaluate. And therefore, value talk is going to be less useful, at least initially, in talking about it. And so my book, Age of M, is in trying to demonstrate these two things, that you can say a lot about the facts in the future and that it's going to be something that's hard for you to decide whether it's good or bad.
Which links so much to what you've said in The Elephant in the Brain too, about how we may say we do something for one reason. We watch a sci-fi movie because It's entertainment, or we want to know about the future. But yeah, the value thing is huge. And a place where this also plays out, I think, in entertainment is our values in superhero movies. The bad guy, the villain, that role has evolved with the values in culture too. So our popular movies
Absolutely.
show different villains through time.
And in fact, apparently, most ancient world stories didn't really have a battle of good and evil in the way our modern stories have. So most modern stories do sort of have good and evil. So our concept of good and evil are sides where each side chose to join that side because they saw it as good or because they saw it as evil, and then they fight it out.
Yeah.
And then they are, it's their primary attachment to this concept of good. Whereas in the ancient world, you grew up in a village or in a culture, and you were just on the side of your people, and there was a war, and you fought on your side, and you didn't really think so much that your side was the good side, in terms of some abstract good or evil, and you didn't think the other side was an evil person for fighting on their side. It was just you were on your side and they were on their side.
Yeah,
but in the modern world, we have really projected this good or evil thing, and that's in part because we are all the more eager to project our concepts of good onto the people around us through stories. We really love the idea that we can show the people around us and ourselves what we think is good and bad through our favorite stories.
Story is such a powerful way to communicate things to another human being, for sure.
About values, especially.
Yeah. Robin, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
Well, I have a blog called overcomingbias.com. I'm at Robin Hanson on Twitter. My books each have a website you can easily find by typing in the title of the book, The Age of M or The Elephant in the Brain. I'm actually pretty easy to find.
Great. Well, Robin, my last question is, at the end, you talked about how people in the end, despite our selfish motives, we still manage to cooperate. What do you think a leader can do to facilitate more cooperation?
Well, in fact, this is one of the primary roles that leaders have always done, in that, subgroups within an organization are more aligned with their individual interests, and the leader can more credibly say, I have the total interest in heart here. I care less about one particular subgroup, and I care more about the whole group. And so that's a thing a leader can credibly say, because once they are a leader, that is their position, in the sense, they are at risk if the whole group does badly. And more so than any one subgroup is. And so one of the roles people have always wanted leaders to play, and they have played, is settling disputes among subgroups, making the peace among subgroups, finding the conflicts and settling them, and dealing with them. And that's what leaders always have been expected to do and should do. And if they don't do that, is seen as a failure. That is, someone who's not finding the subgroups in conflict and resolving those conflicts is not a good leader.
Robin, thank you so much.
That's great to talk to you.
Everybody, that was Dr. Robin Hanson, author of The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And if you want to help us get more great guests like this on the show, then be sure to subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.